So it's a 4 p.m. So I think it's time to get started. So hi, my name is Jong-hee Park. I'm a professor at Seoul National University. I'm in charge of a European program for European studies. And today we have a very fortunate, very fortunate to have two renowned speakers on European issue and security and economic security. So I'm going to introduce Antoine Bondas first, and then I will introduce Francois Schmidt. Antoine Bondas is a research fellow and the director of both Korean program and the Taiwan program at the Foundation for Strategic Research, FRS. And he's a specialist in China, Taiwan, and Korean foreign affairs and security policy. So he's a renowned East Asian specialist in France and in Europe. He was an invited visiting fellow at Korea University in Seoul in 2012. So today, Antoine will talk about innovation at the heart of global power, protecting scientific and technological potential as a basis for economic security. Our second speaker is Francois Schmidt. He's an economist at Mercator Institute for China Studies, that's MERICS, and the Center for Prospective Studies and International Information, CEPI. And his research focused on economic development of China, special attention to foreign trade and related level playing field challenges for trading partners. And today, he will talk about the EU, a full-fledged geo-economic actor in the making. Okay, so we will start from the Antoine and move to Francois. And after Antoine's presentation, we will take one, two, or three questions for the Antoine's presentation. And then we will also take a question about the Francois' presentation after the presentation. And now after that, we'll open the floor and we'll have a discussion about the economic security in Europe and Asia in general. Okay, so let me start from the Antoine Bondas' presentation. Antoine,
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Park. It's always a pleasure to interact with our Korean friends. I was in Seoul there actually 2 or 3 months ago, if I remember well, even before the beginning of the semester. So it's a great pleasure now to come back in the middle of the semester to interact with the students and else. So good afternoon for you. Good morning to Francois. I'm in a different time zone because I'm in Washington. It was unexpected. So it's in the middle of the night. So I will try not to look a bit weird on my face. So my presentation actually will start with 3 main points. The first one is to come back on the notion of geoeconomics, economic security, and the recent evolution. The second one will be to focus on innovation and technologies, especially within the Sino-US rivalry. And 3, of course, to talk about the challenge from the European perspective and the way forward, including what's going on at the EU level. It will not be a presentation about economy per se, because Francois is the economist. So it will be mostly about geopolitics and foreign policy. My first point actually will be to remind you of what geoeconomics is, because economic security fall into the broader term and broader dimension of geoeconomics. Geoeconomics most commonly is understood as the use of economic tools by states to advance geopolitical objectives. One of the quite interesting books from the last few years is a one from the US Ambassador Blackwell, called War by Other Means, Geoeconomics and Statecraft. And in a seminal article entitled From Geopolitics to Geoeconomic Logic of Conflict, Grammar of Commerce, Edward Luttwak in 1990 actually used the term geoeconomics to describe how in the post-Cold War system, the main arena for rivalry among states would be economic rather than military. Yet today, like yesterday, all types of economic activity, trade, access to finance, investments are being used as weapons and tools of disruption in what we could call, or some people called already, an economic warfare. If the term geoeconomics is actually quite new, its reality is quite old. Mercantilism, the dominant economic ideology in Western Europe from the 16th to the 18th century, identified already economic might as the bedrock of national power. To isolate the British Empire, the French Emperor Napoleon ordered an economic blockade over the British Islands and set up a continental system. The British Empire expanded first in Asia through a private company, the East India Company. The Meiji Restoration emphasized, more than 150 years ago, the need to build a prosperous and powerful country, a concept, you know, has been used also by North Korea more recently under the Kongsong-daeguk logic. And China as well has been focusing on so-called building a prosperous and powerful nation. Even core realists in the theory have believed and focused on the importance of economic might. Hans Morgenthau, in the 1940s, one of the core and founding father of classical realism, included, I quote, natural resources in industrial capacity in its 9 quantitative and qualitative sources of power. And John Mearsheimer, one of the founding father of offensive realism in the 1990s, considered, I quote, economic might as the foundation of military might. National self-preservation and economic growth are being the 2 sides of the same coin. End of the quote. Yet, it does not mean, indeed, that military might is no longer relevant. And we can see today from the war in Ukraine to what's going on in South China Sea, from Syria to North Korea, etc. But in today's geoeconomics, I would say that we see a resurgence of economic might after years of thinking that benign cooperation will be the trend of the decades to come. What is new is actually that vulnerabilities are spreading since interdependence deepens, all the more since we do not only trade with our allies anymore, but also with our political competitors, unlike during the Cold War. And of course, that's one of the core ambivalence of the US-China relations today. The signs of increased relevance of geoeconomics are numerous. The United States 2017 National Security Strategy differed from its predecessor in its emphasis of economic statecraft, stating, I quote, that economic security is national security. I'm actually today in Washington, and with the new National Security Strategy published a few days ago, the same concepts remain. As well, oil-rich states, especially Qatar and Saudi Arabia, have deployed a so-called checkbook diplomacy to wield influence in regional affairs. And in the war in Ukraine, Russia is leveraging its energy resources to cement political alliance, drive wedges within counter-alliance, and of course, try to weaken and influence Europe. And of course, China is doing the same. China is leveraging its economic and financial might into political influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also through Beijing use of economic sanctions to pressure its neighbors. Japan in 2010, when China imposed a rare earth embargo to, of course, South Korea since 2016, over the deployment of the THAAD, anti-missile defense system, with, you remember, numerous sanctions from cultural products to cosmetic, including targeted sanctions against conglomerates such as the Lotte company. In that international context, Europeans are feeling more insecure, even though we also use economic tools to promote our interests, from using unilateral sanctions against Russia to overseas development aid to Africa and Southeast Asia, etc. The EU key issue today, nonetheless, is the lack of confidence while having a strong economic power. And I would say that the European lack of confidence is being fed by at least three international trends. The first one, of course, that the international distribution of economic power. The EU is a worldwide regulatory and normative power, yet Westerners are no longer the only one to create standards and norms. We now face two economic superpowers, the US and China, in what we could be labeled more and more as a growing economic bipolarity. In terms of standard setting, for example, China is making inroads both within international organizations, like the International Standard Organization, but also outside international organizations, like setting up bilateral or unilateral cooperation framework as part of the so-called digital Silk Road. The US and China share half of the Fortune Global 500 top companies. And among today 20 top internet leaders, all of them are either American, like Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, or Chinese, like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, etc. And the fear of economic decline is, of course, spreading through Europe. Second, that the return of protectionist policies. No need to comment, for example, of President Trump's trade policies and all-around sanction against China, but also against its European and Asian allies a few years ago. From Europe back then, to be labeled as, I quote, an economic foe by the US president was indeed a very big issue. And we worried, just like in South Korea, that the US might use, even under the Biden administration, its economic might, even against its allies and partners. Third issue of concern, of course, that China's economic rise and the uncertainties about its future path. China has been trying to launch a so-called charm offensive to the EU in the context of US-China growing tensions, yet it's not working, and relationship, including economic cooperation between China and EU, is getting more complicated. I think we'll discuss it later a little bit, but big project like the comprehensive agreement on investment, the so-called CAI, that was agreed on December 2020, was not voted, and now is a frozen agreement between Brussels and Beijing. Among the many concerns we have, of course, that the question of the Chinese investment in Europe, even though it declined since 2016, but also the access to high technologies. And this is all problematic, of course, due to the Chinese blurred lines between public, private, civilian, military, the so-called military-civil fusion strategy, whose impact have often been underestimated in Europe. A wake-up call was the 2016 events when a Chinese company bought the German robot company KUKA, and that company was instrumental to some European defense industry. The second concern, of course, with China, that the use of some international initiative like the Belt and Road Initiative, but more broadly, actually, the use of economic might to leverage political influence. This is what we feared about the so-called 16+1 format between China and Eastern and Central European states, even though that format is now collapsing. In that context, of course, countries should not only manage interdependence and avoid depending too much on any single other country to shield from most geoeconomic attacks, but they also need to address, and maybe to start with that, to address some internal weaknesses. One of the key problems is not geoeconomics that has been existing for centuries, as explained in the introduction, neither globalization, but how its benefits are being shared and how interdependence is being managed. It brings me actually to my second part of the presentation. That is, right now, economic security and innovation technologies are being more and more considered as being at the heart and the foundation of power. The concept of economic security is an old one, and there have been many definitions, including definitions that do not fit the current use of the term. If you get the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, they have been defining economic security for decades as, I quote, the ability of individuals, households, and communities to cover their essential needs sustainably and with dignity. The International Labour Organization defines economic security as being composed of basic social security, defined by the access to basic needs, infrastructure pertaining to health, education, social protection, information, as well as work-related security. So it's clearly not the same meaning that we give today in terms of political meaning of economic security. What we are talking about today is a much more political and even, I would say, geopolitical definition of economic security. The sense of security lies in deterring and responding to possible threats. And economic security is a comprehensive concept that includes reacting to threats that may impede a state's economic stability and development, to deter this kind of threat, to engage in outreach, including in coercive measure against a threatening entity. Geopolitical competition today is reshaping global economy, as I mentioned before, and economic power and means are increasingly used for political purposes. Simultaneously, the fast-changing, increasingly complex contemporary geopolitical context has shifted increased attention to economic security. And it's not surprising that economic security has been receiving increased attention. It includes many aspects from foreign takeovers in investment, trade espionage, security of energy supply, supply chains, etc. The concern actually based on the concepts of economic security applied to technologies and innovation is on the rise both in the US and in China. As I mentioned before, in October 2022, the US National Security Strategy under the Biden administration was published, and the strategy summarized the relationship with China as follows: the United States must outcompete China. There has been growing concern in Washington that Beijing is outpacing the US in key areas, including science and technology. And it's part of a broader reflection of the potential power transition between an established American power and a rising Chinese power. A shift in US policy toward China occurred in the science and technology arena under the Trump administration initially. In 2018, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, so-called FIRMA, was passed to protect US companies, technologies, and critical infrastructure from Chinese investors and suppliers, while the so-called Export Control Reform Act, ECRA, aims to prevent China from gaining access to sensitive technologies that the US suspects may be used for military purposes through the publication of export blacklist. A few weeks later, so in 2018, the so-called Bureau of Industry and Security proposed an initial framework for controlling exports of key technologies and related products targeting China in 14 advanced technology areas, including biotech, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, etc. At the same time, and you remember well, the Trump administration banned in 2019 government agencies from purchasing equipment from Chinese companies such as Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, Tahua, and announcing in 2020 the so-called Clean Network Initiative to get Chinese equipment out of US networks in terms of telecommunication, information, digital economy, etc. The US approach back then was mainly unilateral, including in terms of pressure on US allies, be it Korea or European allies, even though some multilateral approaches were attempted, like the so-called Prague proposals on 5G security in 2019. The election of Joe Biden in DC did not change the basic dynamic, even though the method used changed. While keeping the same priority, China, and the same long-term objective to maintain American primacy, including in tech, the Biden administration intends to adopt a more multilateral and cooperative approach with the US allies and partners, be it in the Indo-Pacific, but also in Europe. And if China is no longer presented as a threat per se, strategic competition, of course, with China in all areas is structuring, remember the outcompete reference. In its speech on China, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in the spring of 2022, described China as, I quote, the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and used a triptych of competition, cooperation, and contestation. He said, I quote, "We will compete with confidence, we will cooperate whenever we can, but we will confront each other whenever we must." Above all, priority given to competition in the scientific and technological field is intensifying, with an additional dimension that is the desire actually to integrate the logic of opposition between democracies and autocracies. In January 2021, President Biden asked his scientific advisor and director of the so-called Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House to guarantee the American lead, particularly with respect to China. The adoption of legislation in DC has multiplied so far, including the so-called America Competes Act of 2022, that has presented an historic investment to increase the production of semiconductors manufactured in America and to stimulate scientific research and technological leadership in the country. And recently, in September 2022, a month ago, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan announced in a very, very important speech, so I advise you to read it, the strengthening of the export control in order, I quote, to maintain competitive advantages in certain key areas and maintain as large as a lead of possible. The speech translated into new rules a few days ago to restrict China's ability to obtain advanced computer chips, to develop and maintain supercomputers, and to manufacture advanced semiconductors. These measures may theoretically actually come at the expense of allies and partners, even though they are presented as being done in part of coordination with them. That coordination on tech and innovation led in 2021 to the Quad, as you know, the US, Japan, India, Australia cooperation framework, to establish a so-called critical and emerging technologies working group. Washington and Tokyo have introduced their own competitiveness and resilience partnership. US and EU have created their trade and technology council, etc. On the other side of the spectrum, China's new approach to economic security bears at least three features that deserve greater attention. The use of industrial policy to address supply chain vulnerabilities exposed especially by US sanctions since the Trump administration. Second, a rapid legal and regulatory evolution of its economic security framework. And third, a significant risk that its new autonomy-focused approach will give Beijing another diplomatic tool for economic coercion. And there is today a consensus in the Chinese literature that the US government will seek to impede the free flow of technology, data, capital, markets, talents between the US and China. So you might wonder now, how does Europe fit into that? And why do we care, I would say? Actually, especially on the question of science and technology, crafting a robust China policy is at the heart of the debate on rethinking interdependence, especially when it comes to scientific cooperation. So far, Europe's approach to Beijing, even though more coordinative and cooperative, is missing a substantive discussion around the weight and place of China in the world, as well as the direction of the bilateral relationship. And the lack of knowledge and the general disinterest prevailed in the part of the political elites, influenced by very erroneous and misperception. In France, the widespread perception is that China dominates already the world economy. And in 2020, 48% of French people, 55% of German people considered China as already the leading economic power worldwide. China is also often caricatured as controlling international organizations, dominating entire sectors of global research, providing the largest amounts of development assistance, etc. So actually there is kind of an odd mixture of concern, defeatism, powerlessness in Europe. And many believe that Europe is no longer a match for China, largely because of the EU economic dependence on Beijing. And it's true, actually, that Europeans have long underestimated the consequences of China's emergence from their own interest. But it's actually important for Europe to take a more realistic look at its own dependencies and recognize that we also have assets and leverages vis-à-vis China. One of the main strengths that Europe brings to the table is scientific and technological lead and our capacity to innovate. In this context, the main debate in both France, Germany, and at the EU level should not resolve about our ability to change China, but rather around how to better protect European interest. First of all, and it's quite important, we need to gain some perspective regarding our economic dependence. Trade between France and China has reached 88 billion euros in 2021. That is roughly the same order of magnitude of the trade we have with Italy, 85 billion, or Belgium, 83 billion, and lags far behind the trade with Germany, that is 150 billion. So our condition and our situation is quite different from the one in Korea, in which you are much more dependent on trade with China. France's problem is actually not the amount of trade with China, but the massive trade imbalance and the trade deficit that is around 40 billion euros last year, and the inability to impose what we call upward reciprocity. Another important factor to consider is the size and relevance of China's investments in France. According to the Bank of France, in 2021, the stock of Chinese FDI, of Chinese investments in France, was less than 10 billion, roughly the size actually of Danish from Denmark investment, but much lower than the stock of Swiss investment, around 90 billion, or Dutch investment from the Netherlands that are above 100 billion. Chinese investment in France have created around the same number of jobs as Canadian investments and 4 times fewer jobs than German investment. So if we consider China as an important partner, we should be aware that European countries are by far our most important partners. Secondly, we should expand the conversation on China to include our mutual interdependencies and not just European dependence. To make this happen, China's supposed lead in research and innovation must be pushed into perspective. The country remains very dependent on its access to foreign technologies, especially from Europe. And in terms of basic research and fundamental research, China is lagging behind. Since 2000, only one Chinese researcher has won a Nobel Prize in the hard sciences, compared to 11 French or 14 German researchers. And in an attempt to catch up, the Chinese authorities, as you know, in their latest 5-year plan, have proposed an increased basic research budget by 11% per year, with the aim of increasing the share of basic research up to 8% of all Chinese research budget. But even so, it will still fall far behind the 17% in the US. Some projects like the so-called Made in China 2025 plan, a broad industrial strategy presented in 2015, was clearly aimed as well to reduce dependence on foreign technologies. Yet, China's tech dependence has led Beijing authorities to implement covert strategies to capture foreign innovation and foreign technologies. Since the US and the UK, especially the US, I mentioned before, have considerably tightened up their access to their technologies for Chinese actors, mainland Europe right now is the primary target of Beijing efforts. And it's high time for Europe to do more and to wake up to the reality of the Chinese strategy of so-called military-civil fusion, I mentioned before, which aim to use civilian means, especially in the private sector, to further military efforts. And we need to be aware that some investments and international cooperation clearly serve a military purpose. It was the case, for example, in 2018, when the Italian military drone company Alpi was acquired by a Chinese private company that ended up to be PLA, People Liberation Army related company. So the European states, of course, should not resort to extreme measures. And the idea is not to stop all form of cooperation we have with China. But it's key to recognize the risk of Beijing to use academic exchanges and scientific and technological cooperation as a mean of acquiring foreign technologies, sometimes in sensitive areas, for the benefit of China. And it's not only a question of industrial, technological, and scientific sovereignty, it's a question of economic competitiveness and national security. Hence, the question of economic security lies at the core. And to keep European interests safe, we must prioritize, just like in Korea, just like in the US, the protection of our scientific and technological potential in our relations with China. That means investing additional resources into protective measures, etc. And it would be, in a way, the end of a form of hypocrisy in which, despite the European embargoes on arms export to China since 1989, Europeans have contributed, directly or indirectly, to the qualitative modernization of the Chinese armed forces. So the good news, of course, is unlike many politicians, French government agencies have been reacting more and more openly to this risk, something we could discuss later. But there is still a long way to go. And European countries urgently need autonomous means to conduct protection and to make sure that we can assess the risk of some form of cooperation. And just to conclude, if Europe actually does not act on the risk posed by China in terms of economic security applied on science and technology, the US might not stand idly by and watch. Washington will likely make public the sensitive nature of some EU-China cooperation to pressure and ultimately block access to the US markets for some European actors. And in June 2022, a report by a consultancy firm in Washington pointed out the risk of the link between Airbus, the plane maker from Europe, and the China military-civil fusion apparatus few days before a mega contract was signed, more than 25 billion euros between Europe and China in terms of plane. So one of the questions we have, of course, in terms of economic security applied to science and technologies is how do we make sure we better protect falling with my chair. How do we make sure we better protect our S&T potential? How do we make sure we do it in coordination with our partners in the region, including South Korea? And how do we make sure that we can have this form of bilateral cooperation between Europe and Korea in making sure we can protect our S&T potential? I will stop here because otherwise it will be too long.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'm going to change the plan a little bit before I take a question for the Antoine. I'm going to directly move to Francois and have a presentation, and then we're going to get the question together because I don't see any question in the chatting box or YouTube streaming channel. So I will move the floor to Francois Schmidt. Francois, you can start. You can unmute yourself. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I had lost the unmute button for a second. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, morning here from Brussels. So speaking from Brussels, I'm going to give you a short presentation of what I would define as the European ambition to become a geo-economic actor. And we'll see that engulfs the question of economic security per se, and that is a broader dimension of the EU, as Antoine mentioned, trying to finally make more proactive use of its economic might in the pursuit of geo-economic interest. The EU is, so we're going to review very shortly the history and the complicated history of the European Union with power-based relation despite its economic might, and then we're going to switch to that recent ambition and the flurry of economic policies and regulations that have been implemented or are being considered in order to build that European geo-economic capacity. And then finally, we'll shortly consider the challenging stress test under which that ambition is now being unfolded. So first and foremost, sorry, I've got my Excel that has failed for 4 days, so I had to found some numbers on the internet directly, but very briefly, the point is, and I think it's sometime overlooked, because we tend to look at international economics as a power issue. And in that case, indeed, the European Union is not always in the mind of everyone. But in terms of economic power, the European Union is probably one of the three, if not the largest economy on the planet. And that is both in terms of GDP, where it represents between 17 to 22% of the world economy, depending on the exact metric that you're using, and the exchange rate of the euro versus the USD and the renminbi, but also in terms of both trade and mostly FDI, so foreign direct investment, where you have seen the European Union weighting at a similar 20, 25, 30%, depending on the metric, but always being on par with the first position, be it when it comes to trade, China, or when it comes to FDI, the United States. This economic capacity has a complicated relation to power, largely because the European Union is de facto, first and foremost, an economic undertaking at the moment. The idea was to build a community of economic interest and a shared market to allow the free flow of people, capital, and products in order to foster European political integration into the European political object that the European Union is. That is not saying that the European Union is short in geo-economic tools, and we'll come back to that, but its primer approach to the world and the way it conceived itself is first and foremost economics, which has indeed very significant geo-economic dimensions. And here especially I'm thinking of all the dimension related to the relation of the European market with the rest of the world. We can engulf that in what we define as trade policies, but nowadays I think it spillovers into many more dimension, competition, R&D cooperation, and M&A merger and acquisition screening, and so on. We'll come back to all that. But the idea here, as you can see, most of the what we call the exclusive competencies of the European Union. So the European Union is a complicated administrative and political setup where you have both member states on the one side, so sovereign nations on the one side, and the European Union, not necessarily on the other, but living together. And in order to organize that structuration of power, we have three distinctive type of political responsibilities. The one that are deemed to be exclusive competencies of the European Union. So basically where member states have little to say, and that little can be significant, both de jure, but even more de facto, because especially when you have large member states being utterly unhappy with some politics or some regulations, indeed, that exclusive competence notion is not really as exclusive as it sounds. Then you have what you called shared competencies. And also on those exclusive competencies, just as you can see, a lot of very economic-centered policies, indeed with geo-economic implications, but first and foremost, economic-centered policies. Then you have the shared competencies, and then you have what we would define as the national competencies that is mostly related, especially for the conversation we are having, to the traditional geopolitical tools, so especially defense and security, but more broadly foreign affairs, still being largely a national competencies. So what we usually have in mind when we think about geoeconomic, it's still in the hand of the EU member state, EU MS, as we tend to call it in Brussels language. This liberal culture, or this economic-centered approach, here we saw the kind of de jure version, so the way the European Union is organized as a political institution. But we also have, I think, to consider something that it's harder to grasp and to quantify, but I think living now in Brussels, something that is very vivid when you switch from capital to Brussels, or even more so if you switch from Beijing to Brussels or from Washington to Brussels, is that the European Union is underpinned by a very strong liberal culture. And don't take that as any form of judgment here. I'm not necessarily criticizing that. It's really an purely analytical point of view, where indeed the European Union was built after the Second World War, was initiated, the building process of the European Union was initiated after the Second World War and after the gigantic trauma that the war caused throughout Europe. And that has led a very large number of Europeans and European states to have a complicated relation with the power of the state, and especially the power given to the executive branch of the state. And so you have a very strong emphasis on individual rights and the constraint on the power of the state, which definitely creates, and once again, this is not necessarily a matter of judgment, but does create some constraint and some impediments in the ability of the state to exercise state power and potentially coercion in order to get citizens or even entities to act according to its will. The idea related, this kind of strong emphasis on individual and property rights is also reflected in an approach of interaction that is largely based on competition as a healthy way to prevent more confrontational type of discussion. And that works, I mean, within country, within the European Union, first and foremost, and that spills over, I would say, into the culture of Europeans towards international affairs. Another dimension that I would relate to the trauma of the Second World War. I spent last year in Germany and I worked for a German think tank. So I would say it's very vivid in the German discussion, is a form of refrain for any grand geopolitical ambition and master plan. So the idea of proactively engaging to directly shape the direction of world affairs is not something all European countries are really comfortable with. There are different cultures in that, definitely France being an outlier here, and the UK as well, most likely. But it is something you really need to consider when you look at Europe, is that most Europeans have a reluctance to be more proactively considering geopolitics and the projection of European powers throughout the globe. Then maybe a more technical point that I think we are, whether we like it or not, more and more witnessing today, is that a lot of the matters related to sovereignty for many Europeans is a national matter. And I'm not here necessarily referring to the political organization and the structure that I've mentioned before, but really the way people consider the topics. And indeed, when citizens are confronted or challenged by matters that relate to sovereignty and economic security, that their first and foremost reaction is to consider what their national state is doing. The European Union is still largely seen among Europeans as an administrative power that regulates the market. It's not clear to all Europeans that it is a proper political power or political entity on its own that can have more than just regulatory capacity. And then two, I think, points that characterize the European, especially compared to, I would say, the other big players in geoeconomics, especially the US and China, is that you have a fundamental tendencies towards openness in many European countries. Once again, the beauty of Europe being diversity. This is not true in every country, especially here when you look at most of the polls that you can find on the matter. France is very often an outlier and has more of a protectionist bias. But for many countries throughout Europe, openness is equivalent to freedom and democracy. That is very true in the eastern part of Europe that was long under the USSR, where basically democracy arrived with alongside with openness, both the economic openness and the political openness to the rest of the world. But it's also true in Southern Europe. It's the case of Spain, for instance, as well as in Northern Europe, where you have a very strong preference for openness against any form of constraint on trade and movement of people. And finally, and I think that's very obvious when you look at the military powers and the use of it, there is a very strong aversion in Europe for hard power in general. This is not something that is considered when we conduct, I would say, proactive public policies. It is considered only on the base, I would say, of defensive policy. And potentially, when you look at recent intervention, that was mostly France that intervened, and it intervened in the near region, largely at the demand of the country in order to guarantee political stability and especially prevent terrorist risk to spill over into the European Union. So this This is, I would say, the deep cultural underpinning under which the European Union is functioning. Now there is also another dimension that I think it's very important to emphasize when you consider the European Union, is that it's really built into an ordoliberal framework, and that was almost what created the European Union. The European Union was de facto created by a market largely, and that market was created under very strong ordoliberal rules. So ordoliberal rules, it's something that largely comes from Germany, and it strongly relates to the creation of the German state, that does look, or actually has very strong similarity in the process with the way the European Union was built, where you have indeed an emphasis on first and foremost create a market in order to get traction for more of a political integration. This ordoliberal dimension is the idea that the state sets the rules of the game and then let the market play, and let the social forces play into the market without direct intervention from the state. And so you can have a reflection of that dimension in the very tight constraint on state aid, for instance, that apply within Europe, which, for instance, for those of you who might be interested, might explain why the EU has a tendency to prefer tighter international regulation on competition and distortion, because it's already much more constrained by its domestic framework than by the WTO framework. That has changed a little bit, but we'll come back to that later on. In general, you have very strict limitation of any discriminatory action by the state when it comes, when it regulates or when it intervenes in the economy. That strongly relates to the previous dimension I scoped through. So the idea that the state cannot discriminate, and here again, most economies function under WTO rules and principles. The EU has built in itself a direct form of WTO plus commitment, largely because it wanted to regulate the internal stiff competition between the EU member states. And to be even more precise, the idea was to constrain the French state and the French public entities in this, preventing any distortion on the European market. And so the ability of free and perfect competition, at least in theory, to happen. The two more indirect dimension is that you have much more constraint on core geopolitical capacity, still a national prerogative, as I mentioned. And when it comes to related matters that are in the hand of the European Union, you still have unanimity rules applying to most cases. And then finally, and I think it's important, it's obvious for many, but I think it's important to remind it, the European Union, as proven very clearly recently, has de facto outsourced most of its defense and security capacity to NATO. So not full outsourcing, because many members, if not most members, are part of NATO, but de facto NATO is largely under American influence and control. And so you do have a form of outsourcing of defense capacity that I think can only happen in very specific historical and political environment. It's not unique to Europe, definitely not. And I guess Koreans know it very well, but it's indeed a strong abnormality throughout history to have sovereign entities, especially a world leading economic power, to have outsourced its defense and security to another world economic power. I forgot maybe one point, that is important, is this preference we have in Europe for competition over the use of market power to constrain, to conduct policy and to have the market play. So basically, very strong pro-competition competition rules that constrain the ability of having big European players that can then exert or apply market power internationally and captured or at least gained market shares. On the top of it, and that does not necessarily help when playing geoeconomics, you have a very complex and cumbersome decision-making process. Here again, do not take that necessarily as a criticism. The European Union is a very unique and very complicated political endeavor of creating a community among a very diverse group of country with different histories. And so you do have behind it especially considering the strong commitment to democracy and representativity that there is throughout the European Union, when you try to have all those, when you take all those dimensions into consideration and try to make a political institution and decision-making process, definitely you tend to end up with something complicated or complex. I just put it here, we can come back to that. But it's important to have in mind when we consider geoeconomics that the European Union is not necessarily quite a regular nation state, as we often that we often have in mind. And finally, all those dimensions might explain why, when you look at geoeconomics, the European Union has a pretty poor track record in terms of performance. We have seen throughout Europe a lot of investment in strategic infrastructure and a lot of dependencies on non-cooperative partners. Here, I think the example of Russia was a very strong wake-up call. I would doubt that country with a different culture, and here I'm definitely thinking of the US and China, and such economic might would have put themselves in such a strong dependencies from such a uncertain and sometimes erratic partner, if not competitor, such as Russia. But you also see it, and it's definitely something that the book Antoine referred to, or through other means underlines, that throughout the Arab Springs you did, which is literally at the border or within the near region of the European Union, you had stiff geoeconomic competition between big players, a lot of Arab Gulf countries as well as the US trying to weigh in on the direction of the Arab Spring. And despite the European Union displaying clear, very positive response to the dynamic of what was at first a form of democratization of most of the Northern African countries, the European Union was largely unable to take any significant action on the ground to wait on the direction of those political turmoil, and ending up with results that is definitely not the one that they had ambition and not corresponding to the EU preferences or interest. Similarly, if you take what has happened in Ukraine since 2014, you do have the impression that despite this being literally at the border of the European Union, the main player has always been the United States from a Ukrainian point of view. And I think the recent events have unfortunately proved that all too well. But even if you consider the fact that Russia had invaded Crimea in 2014, still the European Union did not intervene to block the accession of Russia to the WTO, even though Russia was obviously threatening what the European Union refers to as something of its core interest, which is the stability in its near border. And similarly, the case of Iran is very telling. Especially recently. I mean, there was, well, not so recent, so 4 years ago now. You had a lot of claims among EU leaders and European politicians that the EU will never accept the unilateral exit of the United States from the nuclear deal with Iran and the imposition of very strong sanction. So the EU created a tool to be able to maintain regular economic exchanges with Iran. It took a lot of made a lot of strong commitments and calls in order not to abide by the US and be an independent actor. At the end of the day, that tool has never been used properly. I mean, there was one transaction that was forced to show that the tool is useful, but basically trade between Iran and Europe has stopped. And in reality, so the United States were able to implement or to coerce the European Union in abiding by its own preferences regarding Iran. Similarly, I think the relation with Turkey and the way Erdogan has been able to play migrant as a bargaining chip without having any significant consequences for the bilateral economic relations, political, it's a bit of a different matter, definitely shows that the EU is not necessarily able to use economic tools in the pursuit of its economic interests. And then finally, and I think it's a dimension that has been long completely overlooked and is potentially catching up now on us, unfortunately, is the very weak track record of most European countries and the European Union itself when it comes to implementing sanctions. And here it's a complicated topic, as you have to review 27 different countries on the top of which you also have to look at what the European Union did. But when you look at clear evidence or circumvention and or even breach of sanction, here I'm thinking especially toward North Korea, but also in the past toward Iran, you witness that there is a lack of clear and timely sanction on those economic actors, and especially proportionate sanction compared to the economic benefit those actors gain by breaching those sanctions. And I think this is something that we are now realizing, but was long completely overlooked, and is often considered as obviously there by most people who tend to indeed not pay enough attention to implementation and enforcement of sanction, because often the public conversation and the media tend to focus on the decision of sanction itself, and not necessarily the way it unfolds on the ground. And on a different matters, even when economic matters have a political ambition, we do see that the European Union is not necessarily punching at the level of its economic might. And here, being an economist myself with a focus on trade policy, the European Union has a long record of backtracking on trade defense instrument usage in response to pressure by partner. And here, definitely mostly China, but also other countries. I'm also thinking about the US, but for instance, in 2012, the European Union was considering trade defense instruments on network cable produced by Huawei. At the time, China threatened to coerce individual countries that were important in the decision-making, and all those countries backed down, especially France and Germany, very quickly, and stopped call off those tariffs at the last minute in order not to frustrate China. And even when you look at, I would say, more core economic interest of the European Union, and even its strong preference, which is the WTO reform, we see that there is an inability of the European Union to really implement those reform with strong geopolitical implication. The WTO reform has been the top priority of the EU trade policy for now 5 years, and the EU has been completely unable to create traction on its own for such a reform to, if not necessarily happen, but at least advance. And finally, I think Global Gateway is very telling in that dimension. It has been a strong ambition of the European Union to foster connectivity and economic integration in its near border under a policy that's called Global Gateway, that you hear a lot of discussion and debate about. But the reality is that on the ground, even though this policy has been promoted for now 3 years, it has failed to have any consequence on the ground. And once again, this has to be assessed compared to the size and the might and the economic might of the Europeans. And that is a really strong disconnect between the reality on the ground and those potential capacities when you just look at numbers. Now, this a bit depressing and negative analysis has to be updated through the recent ambition that the European Union has been pursuing. And I would first emphasize that this recent ambition was largely propelled by external factors, and I would not call it necessarily an internally driven turn. I think the European Union was coerced somehow indirectly in becoming a geo-economic actor almost against its will at some point. And here Xi Jinping's China and Trump USA plus the COVID situation have really been the energizer of that new trend. And I pinpointed that, or I started that time frame in 2015 when China published the China 2025 industrial plan. Whatever we think of the plan in itself, it was largely perceived in Europe as well as in the US, as you probably know, as really the acknowledgement that China would not become a standard liberal partner within the WTO framework, but was choosing a different path towards its own model, which is not necessarily uniquely interventionist, but tries to find a new articulation of state and market power. On the top of that, in 2016, Germany, which, let's not shy away from it, is very core to that discussion of the European Union being rooted in a very liberal framework. German public opinion was struck when one of its key and most promising robotic company was bought by a Chinese investors, largely suspected of being supported by state money and with geostrategic or at least geoeconomic objectives at the back of his head. And that was a big shock for Germans. I would even, I think this is in part related to the idea that we discovered that China was not only a trade superpower, but was finally, was clearly having the ambition of becoming an industrial superpower. In the meantime, you obviously had Trump being elected at the White House, and with Trump coming into the White House, you had a very new type of language injected in the transatlantic cooperation. And you have much more unilateral actions being taken from the White House, a really strong discourse of power being carried by the new American president, and a all new set of rules and standards regarding economic policies, and especially international economic policies in the White House. This has led to the end of the Iran deal, the threat of exiting NATO, which for many member states was a huge trauma and a huge shock, but also a direct trade war between the United States and the European Union. It did not have the same magnitude than the one between the US and China, so it often did not caught as much light as the Sino-American trade tensions, and especially technology tension nowadays. But you have to understand that it was a huge trauma for the European Union to have the United States, the one who created that international order into which the European Union is very happy to play. So WTO first and foremost, that is basically breaching and breaking that very same order. And I think the example of the European Union sending the WTO dispute settlement mechanism into a coma is probably the best example of that change of approach from Washington regarding the rule-based order that the European Union fancies so much. I will not necessarily go through every single of those events, but the idea is really you've had a flurry of example of a much more power-based and geo-economic environment, and especially between the three big powers and the big partners of the European Unions, that now the European Union has to live with. And that has indeed sparked a change of direction in the general orientation of the European Union policy. And I would say an ambition for the European Union to become a full-fledged geo-economic actor. And that is, I think, nicely captured under Ms. van der Leyen, so kind of the head of the European Union, actually the head of the Commission, but de facto a very visible character and figure for the Europeans. When she described her own commission as be it a geopolitical commission or being a geopolitical commission. And that has been reflected, I would say, in two streams of work. The first one is the more traditional international economics tools that are now being reorganized under the concept of open strategic autonomy. This might look a bit of a blurry language, but you have to understand that the concept of autonomy for the European Union is a huge, gigantic step forward towards being a more forceful international players. And the idea here is for the European Union to better wait on the course on the general international conversation, and to better protect its own economic interest. Very clearly, they list more assertiveness on international economic matters, more proactive engagement with partners, especially in the form of bilateral trade agreements, and where I think there is a distinction between with the main competitors here, who are China and the US, but I think that's also more aligned with smaller partners from a pure economic size perspective, but says Japan and Korea, to maintain the idea and the ambition to have a rule-based international economic order as a first best target. And even though that is not necessarily fully visible or possible at the moment, it's really rooted at the core of that open strategic autonomy ambition of the European Union. And then the second dimension is a more of a defense and foreign affairs dimension, which it was reviewed under a very recently published strategic compass of the European Union. And you do find this similar wording of the European Union ambitioning to be more assertive and better defend its interests and preferences. And that spills over into geoeconomics, because as part of that reflection, the European Union ambitions more flexible and facilitated decision-making process, more financial solidarity among the European Union, and even some defense and hybrid capacity, even though that is a bit further away from geoeconomic per se. I am not going to delve into each single of those measures, but the idea was really to illustrate the fact that this is having a translation on the ground. You have been seeing since 2018, 2019, a huge number of new regulations and new tools being built up by the European Union. And I have divided them, that's my own characterization, between what I would define as a more level playing field type of tools and a more economic security type of toolbox. I will spare you the one on level playing field, even though they are my core expertise, and they do have a very strong geoeconomic dimension from an EU perspective, because when you want to defend a rule-based order that is based on fair competition, well, your level playing field toolbox becomes, is deeply enshrined with your geoeconomic toolbox, because you define your geoeconomic preferences as a fair competition and rule-based environment. But when it comes to economic security, I think that's where it's even more innovative for the European Union. This is really a realm of tools and considerations that the European Union absolutely did not have in its radar as the EU institution. It was really in the hands of the member states to deal with that up until 2018-19. The first tool and indication that really set the trend was the FDI screening coordination mechanism in 2019. But since then, you have had a very dynamic production of regulations and guidelines and framework by the European Union. So you now have a guidelines on 5G and security that was largely related to the Huawei discussion, but is now being implemented throughout the European Union. You have had a first revision of the EU export control capacity in order to be more flexible and have better enforcement capacity. That was 2019. You've had a revision. A revision of the competition rules in order to allow the European firms to be more concentrated on the European markets. When you have big players on external markets that have such huge size that they can outcompete those European firms. You've had now a regular framework for monitoring trade and economic dependencies. You do have an effort, you do have a directive on the resilience in terms of critical materials. You do have the creation of an observatory of critical technologies. And as you can see, probably because this dimension is rather still new to the European Union, most of the tools that were kickstarted as projects in 2018, 2019 are now in the pipelines of being finalized in 2023. So you have an emergency instrument to intervene on the European market. You have an anti-coercion instrument. You have a blocking state review. You even have an out-the-eye screening investment mechanism now being considered formally by the European Commission. You have a new extension of the export control regime. You have even now Mr. von der Leyen that very recently announced an EU sovereign fund, an EU package to defend democracy, and so on and so forth. We can come back to all those tools in details if you want, but what I think it's really important here is to acknowledge the ambition, and the ambition is very clear. And those tools, when you look at what with the potential they have, they are serious, at least de jure. Then comes the question of how you translate that on the ground, and whether you have the administrative and political capacity to forcefully implement those tools. But we'll come back to that a bit later. On the top of that very direct, I would say, geo-economic agenda, you do have a renewed, or if not a completely new, European ambition to have an industrial policy. And that is formally, officially, directly connected to the issue of resilience of the European economy, that is largely spilling over from, or a consequence of, the difficulties we encountered throughout COVID, that helped everyone in the European Union acknowledging that regular economic interaction might carry risks of dependencies that are not properly reflected in prices and not nicely tackled only by market forces. So potentially a state intervention was legitimate. So you have what the European Union calls important project of common European interest, which is basically a form of carve out on the very tight state rules that I mentioned previously that are operative on the EU market. You've had almost no such project up until 2018, and within 5 years, you now have had 6 projects being already implemented on the ground, even though that is slow to be implemented, but they've already been validated and implementation has started. And you have just as many that are being considered and being literally formally in the pipeline in the making. On the top of it, you have the European Union that has developed a specific regulation on chips, similar or at least with similarities. Yes.
I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt. So could you wrap it up in?
Yes, I'm about to finish.
Yeah.
Yes. And you also have a strategic international agenda being developed by the European Union. I want to emphasize, and this is the graph you have on the right, this is the share of bilateral EU-China trade that is now being covered by EU trade defense instrument. The idea is to show that this ambition is also materializing in quantitative number and objective numbers in terms of more forceful and more assertive enforcement of EU trade defense instrument. Now the question will be with the how much will that impact the reality on the ground? And I think most of the heavy lifting for that ambition is still ahead of us, with now economic stress putting the European unity under test. The obvious challenge that the Russian invasion of Ukraine creates for the European Union and its ambition to be a credible, assertive international player. The articulation with like-minded partners, and especially the US, with recent difficulties in the transatlantic bilateral relation because of what is perceived as unilateral action by Washington. And finally, an issue with implementation and enforcement that is not fully resolved. And you do have a member state that basically do not have the capacity or the political will to properly implement and enforce those ambitions.
All right, thank you so much. It was very exciting presentation, and I think we have a question from the audience in the chat box already, but I will ask 2 questions, one question for the Antoine and another question for the Francois, to break the ice. So the first question to Antoine is, I'm curious about the turning point or wake-up call, if I use your term, about China in European public opinion or European elite on foreign policy. So, the US and Western countries and also East Asian countries, China policy changed from engagement to encirclement or decoupling. And we can describe as a gradual process, or we can describe as a very discrete, dramatic change. Like for example, can we pick a kind of George Kennan's long telegram moment in Cold War for the China policy? Or what causes the dramatic shift in China perspective among European foreign policy elite? And if you choose one or two incident or event or document. So in Francois' presentation, Francois mentioned the China 2025 document was a kind of important like a wake-up call about the possibility of China's change into kind of a more open and liberal, the state is getting dimmer and dimmer. So in your perspective, Antoine, what was the kind of critical event or incident to change people's perception about China from potential strategic partner to the competitor? And the question toward Francois is, I'm very interested in your kind of discussion about the possibility of EU engagement in this economic diplomacy and economic security diplomacy. And I'm very curious about the EU is very care about the order and rules, rule-based international, cooperation and order, liberalism, if I use your term. And I think in that perspective, WTO is one of the most important organization, which is now in coma. And it was turned into a coma during Trump administration, but Biden administration did not act proactively to wake up the WTO. And at the same time, US is kind of take advantage of the lack of the WTO arbitrary function, especially for recent example is Inflation Reduction Act was included like a North American production clause, which is a direct violation of WTO rule, but we cannot go to the WTO because it's the appellate party is not in function. So I think the East Asian countries, especially South Korea and the European Union, has a common interest to revive this rule-based international order while we confronting China. So those two are not mutually exclusive. However, US kind of pretending those two are mutually excluding each other. So can we find a kind of common space of reviving the rule-based international order within the allies and partners, according to the US term? And while maintaining this US-China strategic competition, can we revive a rule-based international order? And how do you assess the possibility? Okay, so let me start from Antoine. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Pak. I would say that the European awakening on China has been kind of a difficult process, in quite of a recent process, and there is not a single reason for it. And I will just list some of the reasons. The first one, especially from the Central European perspective, is kind of the failed expectation. Many of these Central European countries were expecting, including through the 16+1, 17+1 format of cooperation with China, to receive massive investments, massive economic opportunities that failed actually to materialize. The case in Czech Republic, in Lithuania, in Slovenia, etc., is the story actually of China over-promising and not delivering on its promises. Second is, of course, the evolution of Chinese international behavior, be the deterioration of relations between US and China, but more broadly, the more assertive foreign policy, including a more assertive international communication that has contributed to deteriorate the image and the perception of China in Europe and among the public opinion. The third reason is, to be honest, the US policy. And under the Trump administration, there were huge efforts to try to convince Europeans to take a more assertive or tough stance on China. And I think that China back then had not anticipated at all. And the Chinese were convinced that not only the Europeans were non-players, kind of political dwarfs, but also that the Chinese economic might would de facto translate into political influence. I will tell you an anecdote. I was actually in Beijing in late 2018 for a Europe-China kind of discussion on the Belt and Road Initiative and how Europe could fit into it, etc. And the discussion were very optimistic on everything. You know, oh, there is such a big potential, and the future is bright between Europe and China, etc. And at the end of the discussion, I explained to the Chinese that they should expect Central Europe to take a harder stance on China. And their reaction was like, it doesn't make sense. I mean, you know, European countries, especially these countries, are like tiny and small countries. They would never dare to say anything to China. And a few weeks after, Poland was actually the first country in Europe to start investigating about Huawei. And I think what the Chinese miscalculated is that for many European countries, even though, of course, economic relationship with China is important, security from Russia is more important and is paramount. And for these countries, following, of course, the invasion of Crimea in 2014, Russian de facto hybrid warfare around Europe, etc., has led many of these European countries to reassess their relationship with the US and to make sure that the US alliance remain the bedrock of their security. So when the US adopted a more, let's say, assertive stance against China, many of these countries followed because they could not afford to lose the US, and they had to signal to the US that on what matters for Washington, China, they could basically cooperate with the US. So I think that on these all of these reason like filled expectation, the evolution of Chinese international behavior, US incentives, not to say pressure, also, of course, a deterioration in terms of human rights in China, etc., in Xinjiang, etc. All of that contributed to the awakening. And then the awakening, of course, facilitated the convergence of interest and the cohesion and the coordination at the EU level. And as Francois mentioned, 2019 was very important because this is when we got the strategic outlook that labeled China as a partner of cooperation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. So basically, you have the cooperation, competition, confrontation kind of triptych between Europe and China. And I would say that since 2019, relationship has only deteriorated. And I don't see, honestly, any single positive development in the Europe-China relations. COVID and the lack of interaction made it worse. And I think that the 20th Congress in China and the reappointment of Xi Jinping for a third term, etc., is only making everything even more complicated. And I would say, as to paraphrase what the French president keeps saying since 2019, that we've been naive about China in terms of the policymakers, but we're not naive anymore. So, of course, we are shifting. It takes time. We don't want to confront China. And I think that on that, actually, there are many convergences with Korea, in which we are aware of the issues, we're aware of the stakes, but we cannot afford to have an only confrontational view, an only confrontational stance on China. And the key question is, how do we manage to shift while having kind of a moderate position? And once again, that's why we've been pushing within EU for economic security to be on the agenda of Europe-Korea cooperation and coordination, because we basically agree on everything. We cannot afford to just cut off China from our supply chain, etc. We cannot afford it. And at the same time, we need to be more resilient, we need to be more protective, and we need to make sure we can defend our interests.
All right, thank you, Francois. And Antoine, you have a question in the chat box. So Antoine, the Francois, sorry.
Yeah, I'll be short this time. Because if your question is, can we revive the international order in the near future? Unfortunately, my answer is, I think we have to acknowledge that we cannot. And indeed, it's important for Europeans as well as for anyone who has a strong preference for that international order to have a clear view on what the reality is. The US, under Biden, obviously, but also under under Trump, obviously, but also under Mr. Biden, has clear zero interest at the moment to have any traction towards reviving an international order, properly rule-based, so with a form of dispute settlement mechanism, which at the end of the day is basically a coercion that we all agree to set on our own ability to take unilateral, predatory or discriminatory measures. This is not, the US is fully dedicated to stiff strategic competition with China, and everything, I think, is guided towards that direction externally, and internally the idea is to try to reconstruct unity. The event at the Capitol, and quite legitimately so, definitely caused a huge trauma within the elite and the political leadership, and they're trying to find a way to reconstruct their national unity, even if that can create, as you've mentioned, for Inflation Reduction Act, strong friction with allies, because it takes measures that are completely contradictory with the principles and the rules of the WTO. Now, maybe on a slightly more positive tone, that does not prevent like-minded partners, and I'm pretty sure here Korea and Europe are not alone. You take the Ottawa group under Canada, for instance. You have a lot of what they define themselves as friend of the WTO as it is. Those countries can pave the way for what will have to happen at some point, which is we will need to set up a new framework. It might not be a multilateral one, because potentially some actors, and especially China, might be unwilling to participate, irrespective of the concession we can make, without breaching our own red lines in terms of preference. But at least it will pave the way for a conversation we will need to have further down the road among like-minded allies. And I think here, indeed, I hope it's not happening at the moment, because obviously the European Union has other priorities because of the war in Ukraine and the economic situation that is unfolding. But I hope the European Union and DG Trade in particular will kickstart again their outreach efforts regarding WTO, and especially creating framework for conversation, and creating joint perspective, and even potentially proposition.
Thank you. So we have two questions from the YouTube, and I'm going to start from the second one because it's for both of you. So in Korea, there are concerns that Americans do not care enough about the collateral damage their economic policy targeting China may cause on their allies. Is that sentiment found in France and Europe as well? It's a question to both of you. And another question to Dr. Bondars is that if France is actually not as dependent as the French people think, why would the people in France fall to defeatism vis-a-vis the Chinese economic influence? I think it was mentioned during your talk, and that was in that context. And another question to both speakers is, do you anticipate this shift to economic security around the globe to be a deadly blow to the idea of liberalism when it comes to international relations in general and the free market economy in particular? Or do you think the liberalism will be rebound after that? So we have two questions to both of you, and another question to Antoine. So Antoine, you can start.
If I may start on the problem I mentioned, that we are not that dependent on China, yet we believe we are. In international relation, and especially in foreign policy, perception matters. And discursive power matters. China has been actually very effective for many years to shape the debates, shape the narrative, and convince many Europeans that we were fully dependent on China and that China was an opportunity we could not afford to miss. And once again, no one in the French debate just provided figures and facts like I just did, in terms of bilateral trade, in terms of investment, etc. And the idea was just, there is nothing to debate. I mean, China is so important that we need China and we are dependent on China, with no further political and factual debate. So first, I think we need to be aware of the situation and that to put China on the agenda and to discuss based on facts and figures. Then you can discuss whether public policy, foreign policy, and public policy are going to change. I think the awakening in Europe is also being enabled because we are having that debate. The objective, of course, is not to fully decouple with China, is not to become anti-China. That's not the debate. The question is, how do we defend our interests based on the reality of them and based on the factual relations we have with China? And it brings me actually to then the other question. So on the question of the US policy and the impact on the ally, I'm in Washington to discuss some transatlantic cooperation on China, and that's something we explain to the Americans, especially within the National Security Council. So Laura Rosenberger and the other people working on China at the National Security Council is, we need to discuss the impacts of the unilateral sanctions and new regulation that the US is adopting, because we are de facto suffering from it. Let's discuss the microchips and the semiconductors sanctions. I'm not going to say that Europe suffers so much because we're not big producers, unlike Samsung in Korea, so you will suffer much more than we do. But on other issues, we are de facto affected. It means that we need more coordination. We need more coordination. The EU-US Tech and Trade Council is supposed to be used for that. I think there has been a lot of coordination on the US side with Korea and Japan, be it in the trilateral format or in the quadrilateral format with what's the name, the CHIPS 4, with so US, Japan, Korea and Taiwan. So the US are trying, but I think we are not anticipating enough what are going to be an impact. And I really want to insist that the US is basically increasing and improving its export control to China. The US is limiting scientific and technological cooperation with China, and it's only the first step. The US will not stop here, because the next step will be for Washington to make sure that the key US allies and partners do the same. Either we just coordinate or they just coerce us to do it. Because if the objective is for China to not to access to some sensitive technologies, that's the end goal. The end goal is not to access only US technologies, but not to access any kind of technologies that will be useful for the Chinese military. And of course, the US is doing the job first on its side, so to try to protect its own S&T potential. But then what they will do next is to convince and force us, Koreans, Europeans, to do the same. So I think we need to expect a US effort in the coming years to make sure that we also restrict access to our core and sensitive technologies. And it's going to be impactful for us, because if we do not do it, once again, the US will coerce us in doing it. So we need to discuss it, to discuss whether it's in our interest or not to do so. I do believe that it is in our interest. And I do believe that, honestly, there is a form of hypocrisy in Europe in which, let's take the example of the Taiwan Strait. We keep saying that we want to maintain stability in the Taiwan Strait, that we oppose a unilateral change of the status quo by force. But at the same time, we contribute to modernizing the PLA. We contribute to increase Chinese capacities, especially on the qualitative dimension, because through cooperation, through a lack of export control sometimes, we de facto contribute. So we need to be clear on our objective, and we need to be clear that we need to protect better our technologies. It does not mean that it is, like a decouple between democracy and autocracy, etc. But it's just that we do what we should have done many years ago, that is just to ensure that we can protect S&T potential. And I think that on that, Europe and Korea might converge, that we have common interest in doing so, simply.
Okay, thank you, Francois.
Yeah, so on the question of liberalism and economic security, I mean, let's acknowledge that almost conceptually speaking, economic security is confrontational with liberalism, by the simple fact that by saying that we need to take into account economic security, it means that the free market we had before, or that we are trying to have before, was not taking it well into account. It was what we define in economics as an negative externality that was not well reflected in the price on the market. So indeed, when we try to consider economic security, it means that we try to reassess beyond financial prices and try to re-input a security dimension into the value that we put to economic exchange. That being said, it does not mean economic security will trump any form of free market. I think it's just a redefinition of the boundaries of what is national security, with now a second layer that is a blurry gray zone where market forces will have to cooperate with state intervention, be it direct or indirect. That's the way we're going. Everyone is going to choose how it proceeds. But I don't necessarily, I do see a form of friction, a form of conflict, but I think there is a way forward to have the two working together and both being together in the gray zone and having their own realm of implementation, or their own realm of existence. On one point, maybe indeed internationally, that might necessitate with non-like-minded partners more of, a broader review. It doesn't mean decoupling, and here I want to insist, especially in Europe, when you have a European analyst or politician that makes his position based on the fact that he doesn't want to decouple, he is either intellectually limited or not being honest in his approach, because that's absolutely not a binary question, or do we decouple or do we fully couple? It's an idea of how do we integrate, and where do we decide that this creates too many risks, so we do not engage, this creates risks, so we mitigate those risks, and this is risk-free, so we just let it happen. And very often in Europe, the people who kind of play the fool and say we don't want to decouple are the ones that support a status quo approach and use that hypothetical fear of decoupling, which is far away from the European mindset and far away from the European capacity, as a decisive argument to make their case. And I think it's pretty dishonest and not helping the conversation, because we need to have a very complex conversation on how do we couple with not like-minded and potentially non-cooperative partners. Now, finally, on the question of EU capacity and the risk, I do see the American intention to create framework for coordination with allies, and that is definitely a gigantic divergence between the Trump and the Biden administration. My question mark is, are the Americans capable of coordinating? Coordinating is costly. It takes political capital, it takes time, it takes effort. I have the impression, and obviously I'm a bit burned by the recent Inflation Reduction Act, but I have the impression that they have set all those framework, IPEF, TTC, the Quad, the four chips alliance, and so on, but they have not really put their effort where their mouth is. And at the moment, I'm afraid that the political pressure in Washington to act and to try to prevent a return to, let's admit, extremist radical in the White House has created a sense of urgencies that is an impediment for coordination. So it's not a conclusive case, it's still a pending question, but it's just a fear that I have that beyond the intention, they might not be able to deliver.
And if I can just jump in, I mean, that the issue of coordination, but also the issue of implementation. And we have many historical precedents of us trying to have huge kind of mechanism in terms of export control that are coordinated. And if you take the example of the COCOM, in the 1950s, the idea was to limit the access of the Soviet Union to Western technologies. We partly failed. And we had actually in the very early 50s, something called the CHICOM. So the idea was, of course, to limit the access of Western technologies to China, and it failed to materialize, and we failed to implement it, etc. So I would say that if we want to coordinate on export control, we need to be honest and kind of straightforward of what failed historically. And it's even more easy now, I would say, to circumvent this kind of export control mechanism. So that's a key question: coordination and implementation. And if you want to implement export control, if you want to implement the protection of the S&T potential, science and technological potential, you need a lot of capacities, a lot of people working on it, a lot of, let's say, new digital tools to implement it. And that's a key question. I mean, there is the political will, that's, I would say, easy to have it, it's on and off, but then to implement is one of the key.
Oh yeah, thank you. And I want to add one more thing, is transparency among like-minded states. So that they asked for the information to the Samsung, Hyundai, and ASML, but they didn't share the information. So I think if the information flow is one side, we cannot cooperate. So, okay, the last question, sorry about that. We have only 5 minutes. So the last question from the YouTube is a question about political, tension or domestic politics or member state politics in the Europe. And it's from the Yu Yong-seo, is a master student. There is some political tension within EU, especially the rise of far-right powers in East Europe, such as Hungary, which try to reduce the influence of EU domestically. Can this be considered as a political crisis of EU or just a temporary event? And if I a little bit twist this question toward our conversation is, does political, perspective different on China problem or Taiwan problem in the EU? So the far right, far left, or center, they do have the shared view on China or Taiwan problem, or they have a very, very different view?
I would say, to have a kind of a brief answer, that we are not fully aligned, even though there is a common position at the EU, but I would say that the dynamic is being shared. So you have variation, but the dynamic and the spectrum is much smaller or tighter than before. On the consequences of far right, etc., in Europe, it's complicated. So far on foreign policy, honestly, the impact has been quite limited. Many EU member states are like playing, a two-faced game. So let's take Hungary, basically. They will accept EU sanctions, and they could veto it because it's a council decision. So Hungary could veto sanctions in China, what happened in early 2021. They do not, so they accept the sanctions. And then they say publicly to the Chinese, oh, I think sanction is not a good thing, etc. So they're playing both games, actually. And they are not always being fully honest. They are trying, of course, to side with the EU and at the same time to benefit and try to get some de facto concession from China. So I think we should not overestimate the divergences. You can see on Ukraine that even though some countries might have different perception, etc., on what's going on in the war in Ukraine, we basically all agreed on the objective. Then, of course, the implementation is complicated. Some countries will suffer the costs of these unilateral sanctions more than others. And if you are today in Austria, the consequences are much bigger than if you are in Portugal or even Ireland. So I would say once again that the far-right movement in Europe so far have had a limited impact. We will see in Italy, as you know, Giorgia Meloni was just appointed as the kind of prime minister. So far, the impact has been limited, and there has been a growing convergence in Europe. And I think on foreign policy and security and defense, we've never been that united. It does not mean that we agree on everything. It does not mean that we fully align, but it means that there is an unprecedented level of coordination, and external events, including the war in Ukraine, have helped us to build that consensus and to build that coordination.
Thank you. Francois?
Yeah, very, very briefly, I would more worry and focus on the dynamic among core European countries. If the core, which a large definition, if you have a substantial amount of European countries that want to move forward with a well-aligned and well-conceived agenda, the marginal or the localized frictions and opposition will be overcome. My fear at the moment, or my interrogation, is that with mounting economic pressure and high political uncertainty, or uncertainty regarding the orientation of public policy in Germany, I'm afraid that the core of the European Union loses traction. And indeed, if it loses traction, it will shift the blame on some marginal actor, be it far right, being Hungary, saying, well, those people prevented us to move forward anyhow. But if we have proper traction and proper coordination among the core, as Antoine said, I'm pretty sure things will keep on moving forward, not without some marginal issues in terms of implementation and so on. But to me, that's the core. I mean, that's the crux of the matter.
All right, thank you so much. It was, just on time. It was 3 minutes before our scheduled time, and it was not a most convenient time for both of you. So thank you for having the conversation with us, and it was really, learning experience to the situation in Europe and European perspective, and also we as Asian people share the kind of same concern and same hope about the current event in the international affairs. Thank you so much, and thank you for the audience for the participation. Okay, I will see you later in the next moment.
Thank you very much, Professor Park, and we hope it has been useful for the students, and keep doing the great job of enlightening the students about European politics that sometimes even us Europeans have some difficulty to understand. So you're doing a very, very important job in Korea.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Antoine.
Thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.
Have a good
Pleasure,
sleep.
as always.